Greetings, this is Jared Love, and in this video I'm going to be going over movable pivots, which you could actually also call them animatable pivots or dynamic pivots, whatever floats your boat. But the basic idea here is that you have something, a node or a shape or something that you want to rotate, but you also want to set up a control that allows you to move the pivot that it's rotating from. So you can essentially move the pivot wherever you need to based on your animation, and then it will rotate from that spot, rather than having to pre-plan out ahead of time every single rotate pivot location you need, put a node there, group them all together, and then rotate from all those different pivots. So this allows you to just create that pivot that you can move and key and then rotate, and that'll get what you need with just one simple little node setup instead of a bajillion extra pivots. Now I've got two methods that I'm going to show you how to do this with that both kind of have their pros and cons. But before going into that, I need to discuss something that's going to kind of look a little odd if you're unfamiliar with this type of setup. So if I have my pivot and I've got it in a rotated state, and then I move it, you see, and watch here, I'm only moving in one vector, so it's only going in Z, but the cube looks like it's moving in X, which is going to kind of feel a little odd because, you know, you're moving this way, but the cube is moving this way. Now, technically speaking, this isn't actually broken. It is working correctly, but it's just going to feel a little weird. So, to kind of help illustrate what's going on, I have another cube here, and I've connected the translates of these locators, so they're just going to work in tandem of each other. And this locator is parented underneath this cube. So if I move this locator along here on this one vector, you can see in both situations it's just going front to back. So if we take this one and rotate it, and then as I move it, again, I'm still just moving in that one vector. You just see that translate Z is here moving. Notice on the blue cube how that pivot just slides back and forth in a straight line. It's not going in a diagonal direction. It's just going from the front to the back. And if I look at this one from the top, if you watch where the pivot is sliding along, again, you'll notice it's only going from the front to the back. It's not changing and going to one of the other corners or anything. And you'll also notice that it stays along this Z axis line. It's not going anywhere in the X. So another way to illustrate it, let me just zero this out real quick. You see, okay, my cube is in its default position, and if I rotate it a little bit, and then if I move that pivot back, so I go to the back of the cube, and now if I rotate it back to 0, you see the cube is still technically in the same spot. So it hasn't really moved. It just kind of looks like it's moving, but the pivot is what's changing its location, and so because you're moving that pivot in a rotated space, it's going to feel like it's moving and kind of be a little weird. So as long as you're aware of that, then it will be easier for you to know what's going on as you're animating it, and if you have it rotated and you decide to move it to a new location. So you can kind of account for that. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and break the connections between those two there, and let me quickly show you what the hierarchy is for these two. So these two cubes are set up in two different ways. So the first one we kind of already looked at, the red one here. You have the locator, you have a negation node, and you have the cube parented under that. Now, I have another video on how to set up negations, so you can take a look at that if you're unfamiliar with how to do that. So what this is doing is, as I move the locator, the negation node is moving the opposite direction so that the cube essentially stays where it is and it doesn't actually move anywhere. And then when I rotate my locator, since both of these nodes are parented underneath that locator, it just rides along with it in the case of any normal parenting situation. Okay, so for this one, I actually have the cube and I rotate the cube, and then I arrow down to my locator, which is parented underneath it, and then that's the node I move, and I'm going to put it in object space since this is parented underneath it. So now you see I'm only doing the one vector, translate Z, and it slides around like that, similar to how this cube was doing. But then if I arrow back up and rotate, that's my new location. Now, rotating the locator in this case doesn't really do anything, because all it is you're taking the translations and you're using that to tell this node how and where it's going to rotate from. So the setup for that one is very easy. This up here is the red cube and this is the blue cube. So basically you've got the translates of your locator that's parented under that cube going into the rotate pivot. Like I said, very easy. So to kind of help give a bit better idea of how you might actually utilize these, I've got a couple of examples that I can show you. So the first example is these teeth. So if you think of this like a teeth control inside your mouth, and I know this is really fancy looking teeth, but again, I do these simple examples to kind of help illustrate the principle behind it. So I have this control that I can move around and rotate, and you could even scale it if you want. And so that's your main control for this palette. But say you're in a situation where you've got the jaw open and the teeth aren't quite in the right spot. You want to basically have the back of the teeth rock upward a little bit. So if you have a single pivot that cannot be manipulated, then you would have to move this up and rotate this so that you can make sure that those teeth stay where they are and get the teeth rotated upward. And that's a lot of extra animating and moving around and fidgeting back and forth to try and figure it out. Or you would have to open the jaw more and maybe move the jaw around and then change your lip alignment and all that kind of stuff just to make it look right again. So what you do here is this is set up like the blue cube. So you would pick walk down and then you'd be on your rotation pivot, and then you could move this pivot up here to the top of the teeth and then go back up, and then that is now where your control is rotating from. So this basically allows you to leave those teeth in the top and front exactly where they are, but you can rock the back of the teeth upward to however you need to do it. And there's no extra counter animation of moving and rotating and moving and rotating until you get it just right. You can just quickly move that pivot, rotate it up, and bam, you got it. So you also notice I've got this guy here, and what it is the scale pivot. So I can move the scaling to happen from anywhere I want to along the same vein as that rotation pivot. So say you're in a situation where, I don't know, your character's getting squished from the side of the face or something, and you have the teeth penetrating through, and you want to basically just kind of fake it to where you get rid of that penetration. So if we're here and then now you scale it, you can scale it from the side of the teeth so that you can get rid of that penetration issue. Or you might also have a situation where the bottom of the teeth is poking through your gums or something like that. So you can arrow down and over to get to your locator. You can move it up to the top of your teeth, and then when you go back up, you can scale from the top of the teeth, and it will help you get that without changing the position of the top. So, okay. So that's just a few examples. And the way this is set up, if we look over here, so we have the teeth control, and then directly underneath it I have the rotate pivot and then the scale pivot control. And over here you can see that the rotation pivot control is connected into the rotate pivot, and the scale pivot control is connected into the scale pivot. And I've done all the XYZs instead of the multi-adder. So Real simple setup. Okay, so the last one to show you is these foot setups. So here I've got one setup that's kind of similar to a lot of other foot tutorials I've seen, where you've got, actually in both of these, I've got this roll attribute that kind of rolls the foot up, doing the heel, ball, toe. And I don't have any actual IK in here, I'm just sort of faking it, but anyway. Then this one also has this bank attribute, so it rocks the foot back and forth on its sides. And then I didn't add the attributes, but there would usually be several attributes on here like heel twist, ball twist, toe twist, and what they would do is they would rotate these pivots like this, you know, so you've got your ball twisting and toe twisting and stuff like that. And so these are all predetermined pivot locations, and even their rotation vectors are predetermined. So you see here, instead of going straight along with the foot, this one's rotated slightly so that you can keep this corner and that corner of the ball and the heel on the ground as it's going off of this bank. So one potential problem with that is if you were to utilize the attribute that does the heel pivot twisting out and the toe pivot twisting out, you're doubling up your controls and you're adding in unnecessary stuff essentially, where you could have just grabbed the foot control and moved it out sideways and that would have done the same thing. But it's also worth noting that this actually unfortunately messes up your foot roll. So it looks fine here, but as you go back on the foot, see your actual heel pivot is back here. It's no longer at the back of the actual character's heel. So it's not a huge deal necessarily. It's kind of more just an animator education thing where you say, hey, don't use those heel twist and toe twist controls in unison. You got to use them one at a time. And I just want to clarify, I'm not trying to knock those other tutorials and stuff. This is just another option that you can use that you may or may not be aware of. So in this setup on this foot, what I've got is a movable pivot. So it's much more simplified. So if we look at the hierarchy here of these two, you know, I've got the ball twist, I've got these extra pivots. You pretty much just put pivots wherever you need them, and so you've got all these predetermined pivot locations. And with this one, we got your foot control, and that goes down into your movable pivot, and then underneath that you've got your negation, and then you've got all of the rest of the foot hierarchy in there. So this is set up kind of like that red cube was, where you know you move the locator around, and then when you rotate it, the object rotates from that pivot location. So you can essentially, like say you needed to grind something into the ground, you can put the pivot there, you can move it up to the front of the foot, and then when you rotate it, you would be rotating from that point. And it's also important to note that regardless of where you've got this position, I mean, you could even have the rotation pivot out here. I don't know why you would do that, but you could. And then if you did the roll, you see the foot roll is still happening exactly on the foot. It's not kind of off of the foot like the red foot was. So something else you could do with this, you could have, and on this one I didn't put the banking attribute, but you could do your own banking with this pivot if you move it wherever you want it to. And personally, I don't really see the need for the banking attribute. I mean, I think it's kind of cool and all. It's really neat to be able to rock the foot back and forth, but I think that in most cases you're going to be doing that so very rarely that it doesn't really warrant the need to put in those extra pivots and all that extra stuff just to just to have that cool back and forth rocking, especially when you have a case where you've got the pivots actually set up to where you can move it and rotate it however you want. Now, one small drawback with this is that you would probably still have to do more than one rotation attribute channel to get that back of the foot to stay on the ground, and that would be a little bit annoying. But even having said that, I think the situation for that to happen would be so rare that it would be fine to use just the single setup. And now, any animators out there who are watching this, you guys can feel free to comment and put me in my place on that one. I'll be humble. I'll accept that you guys know better than me for that one. But that's just my personal thought. Now, I did go ahead and try an experiment where this guy is very similar to this foot. But what I did was I set this up to where you could actually rotate it, and it negates the rotation, so that then this sphere is what the actual rotation pivot control is. So what you can do with this is you can set this over here, and then you would arrow down into your actual pivot, and that's where your rotation is. But see, on this, the foot is coming off the ground, So what you could do is right here you can rotate your pivot so that it lines up with the side of your foot, and then when you go down again and then rotate this guy, it's rotating and the foot is staying on the ground on that plane. Now, say you wanted to actually rotate along this one so that the front of the toe is what your angle of rotation is based on. So then you'd arrow down, and then when I rotate, you see the toe is staying on the ground and the rest of the foot is what's leaving. So you could also do the same thing with the inside of the foot. You can rotate it like this and then go down, and then you rotating off of that pivot, or with just a slight tweak have it pointing down here, and then when you arrow down to your actual rotation control, you see that heel is staying on the ground. So it's a cool little option. It is a little bit more tedious to animate with this one because you are having to you can't just move it and then rotate it the same way you can with this one, where you just move and that is the new rotation location. You have to actually go down to the other node, and then that's where you can then rotate from with either your twisting or your banking. And now the way this one's set up, again, you can reference that negation video that I made, but really quickly, you've got your foot control, and then you've got your movable pivot, and underneath that is the actual twisting control, which that's why I named it twist, so the one that actually rotates the foot. And then you have this rotation negation and translation negation, and then those are both being driven by the pivot control. And then you have the rest of your foot hierarchy underneath that. So one thing you could do is if you really liked the banking option, you could make kind of a hybrid situation where you go ahead and put those pivots in here on this foot, and so they would be underneath your movable pivot, and then you can set up those banking attributes there. Another thing you may want to do is you could put, like, say for example on this heel attribute rolling up, like maybe you misplaced this heel pivot and it needs to be kind of like inside here just a little bit more to account for some smoothing aspect of the geometry. Then what you can do is you could set up similar to the blue cube, where you have that movable pivot below the actual node that is doing the rotation, and then hook it into those rotate pivot attributes. And then you could move this in where you wanted it to, kind of set it and forget it, and then that's good from then on. You could also say you like in this banking thing, if you liked the ability to where you could have it bank off on this plane of the foot or on this plane of the foot, or for that matter just kind of anywhere in the foot, if you wanted it to do that and be that open, then you could do a translation and rotation negation movable pivot to where you could move this wherever you wanted to and orient it however you wanted to, and then you would still have that bank attribute that is adjusting the rotate Z in this case to make it rotate upward. So that would make these pivots a little bit more versatile. But it's kind of up to you. I hope I gave you enough to be able to adapt it to your own needs to suit what you need to do. And this was just a few examples. You can put these movable pivots pretty much anywhere. I mean, you could put them into your hips and chest controls. You could put it into your hand controls, kind of wherever you want to put a pivot that you can change the rotation location from. So I hope you found that video useful, and feel free to leave any comments or questions, and have a blessed day.